There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from suppression. And I lived in that silence for years. I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because somewhere along the way, I learned that my voice made people uncomfortable. So I tucked it away. The silence grew roots. It settled into the cracks of my spirit. I smiled when I didn't want to, laughed when things weren't funny, and agreed even when my soul said no. I was performing, not living, wearing the right clothes, saying the right words, doing the right things. And still, I felt like I wasn't enough. That's the thing about performance. You can be applauded by everyone and still feel unseen. I remember sitting in a crowded room, laughing on cue, and suddenly realizing I felt completely alone. It was in that moment that something cracked open in me. A quiet voice. One that had long been buried beneath expectations. It whispered, "There has to be more than this." That whisper didn't go away. It followed me into my car, into my kitchen, into my dreams, and eventually into the mirror. I stood there, staring at my reflection, noticing how tired my eyes looked. Not from lack of sleep, but from years of hiding. I didn't even know what I liked anymore, what I wanted, what I needed, because I had become so good at adapting that I forgot how to just be. So I asked myself a question. When did you stop choosing yourself? And the memories came flooding in. Moments where I said yes out of fear. Moments I swallowed my truth to keep the peace. Moments I made myself smaller, just so someone else could feel big. I realized I had been trained to please, rewarded for being agreeable, praised for being polite, but never taught how to honor myself. No one told me that silence, when used to avoid conflict, is a slow betrayal of the soul. And so, I began to feel the weight of my own silence. Every time I didn't speak up, every time I hid how I felt, every time I smiled while breaking inside. I wasn't being kind. I was being absent from myself. And that realization hurt more than any rejection ever could. Because I had abandoned me. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in small, subtle ways. 1,000 little yes that should have been no. 1,000 moments where I needed care and gave it to others instead. So I began to write. Not for clarity. Not for answers. But to listen. I asked my heart to speak. And slowly she did. She told me she missed being heard. That she was tired of being edited. That she longed to be messy, real, and whole. I started letting the words pour out. The anger, the sadness, the guilt, and even the resentment I swore I didn't carry. It was all there, beneath the surface, waiting to be honored. Some days I wrote for hours. Others I just sat in silence, not the kind that suffocated me, but the kind that held me. I started going on walks without headphones, letting nature speak to me, letting the wind remind me that stillness is not the same as stuckness. I lit candles in my room at night, not for the scent, but for the ceremony. I was coming home to myself, and that deserved light. It didn't feel natural at first. Choosing me, sitting with me, caring for me. It felt unfamiliar and sacred, like touching something holy I didn't know I had access to. And in that silence, the kind I finally welcomed, I heard something new. Not shame, not fear, but truth. Truth doesn't yell. It doesn't force. It waits. And when you're ready, it wraps its arms around you and says, "I've been here all along." I cried the first time I heard it, not because it hurt, but because it healed. That was the moment I realized I had always been enough. I just forgot. I had been silencing the part of me that already knew. And that's where the journey began. Not with a loud decision, but with a quiet reunion. I didn't expect healing to feel like grief. I thought it would be all peace and light and progress. But what no one told me is that when you begin to let go of who you were taught to be, you also have to mourn the version of yourself you created just to survive. And that version, she worked hard. She protected me. She helped me make it through. But she was tired. And it was time to let her rest. I started remembering all the little compromises I made, all the times I said yes to be liked, to be safe, to be enough. And I realized I had been living someone else's blueprint. Expectations passed down from family, culture, society. None of them felt like mine. I was layered in beliefs that never belonged to me. Peeling them off wasn't easy. It felt like tearing away pieces of my identity. Who am I without their approval? Without their applause? The unraveling wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was in the way I paused before saying yes and asked myself, do I actually want this? It was in the way I walked away from conversations that didn't honor me. In the way I chose solitude over shallow acceptance. There were days I felt lost, disconnected from everything I used to cling to. But there were also moments of clarity that felt like coming up for air after being underwater for far too long. I started to notice how often I apologized for existing. Sorry I'm late. Sorry I'm emotional. Sorry I need a moment. And I wondered, when did being human become something I needed to be sorry for? So I gave myself permission. Permission to feel. Permission to say no. Permission to change my mind. Permission to be messy, inconsistent, real. I started standing in front of the mirror and saying things I never believed before. You're worthy. You don't have to perform today. You're still lovable, even when you're tired. And yes, there were still days where doubt crept in like a fog. Days when I didn't feel strong. Days I wanted to retreat. But something had changed. Even in my lowest moments, I didn't abandon myself. I stayed. I held my own hand. I whispered, we've come too far to give up now. The unraveling made space for truth. I learned that strength is not about holding it all together. Sometimes strength is falling apart and still choosing to rise. I stopped idolizing perfection. I started honoring progress. I celebrated tiny wins, like saying what I really felt in a conversation or taking a break before burnout set in. I revisited old stories, the ones I used to tell myself about who I was. Stories like I'm too sensitive, or I don't belong, or I always mess things up. And I asked myself who gave me these lines, who handed me this script. It was time to rewrite the narrative. I am not too sensitive. I am deeply intuitive. I don't always mess things up. I'm learning, growing, evolving. I do belong, exactly as I am. As I unraveled the lies, I started stitching together a new identity. One that felt like home. I started finding joy in the little things. Hot tea in the morning, long walks at dusk, deep conversations that nourish my spirit. I stopped waiting for big, life-altering moments to feel alive. I realized life was happening right here in the now. I noticed how often I had been living for some future version of myself. When I lose the weight, when I finally succeed, when they see my worth. But healing reminded me that worth isn't a destination. It's not out there. It's already here. So I slowed down. I breathed deeper. I paid attention to how my body responded to people, to spaces, to words. I stopped ignoring the tension in my shoulders. I started asking, what do I need right now? I listened. I responded with compassion instead of judgment. And slowly, I began to trust myself. Not the version that followed all the rules. The version that was learning to live from the inside out. The version that didn't need to be everything for everyone. Just enough for herself. I started to enjoy my own company. I stopped filling my calendar just to avoid being alone. I realized that my own presence was not something to escape. It was something sacred. I began to laugh without performing. To cry without apologizing. To rest without guilt. To dream again, not because someone told me I could, but because I finally believed it for myself. And yes, some people drifted away. Some didn't recognize this new version of me. They missed the girl who always said yes, who always agreed, who never made waves. But I didn't miss her. I honored her. I thanked her. And then I let her go. Because I was becoming someone new. Someone rooted. Someone aware. Someone awake. And that kind of becoming? It's uncomfortable. It's unpredictable. But it's also powerful. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. There came a day when I woke up and didn't feel the weight right away. It surprised me. It was subtle, but real. Like something had shifted. Like my soul had taken a deeper breath while I slept. I didn't rush out of bed that morning. I laid there, hand over my heart, listening to the rhythm of my own breath. I used to dread waking up. Another day to pretend. Another day to survive. But that day was different. I felt curious about myself. Curious about who I was becoming. I walked to the mirror, not to fix anything, but to notice. My eyes looked softer. My shoulders didn't feel like armor anymore. My face carried stories, and instead of hiding them, I honored them. I wasn't chasing perfection anymore. I was choosing presence. The awakening wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 little moments stitched together with grace. It was how I said no without flinching. It was how I chose silence instead of over-explaining. It was how I dressed for joy instead of approval. It was how I finally started smiling because I felt like it, not because I was told I should. There was no ceremony, no audience, just me, choosing to show up for myself. And that was enough. I began to notice things I used to miss. The way light dances across the kitchen floor in the morning. The sound of birds I used to tune out. The warmth of tea in my hands. I didn't need big milestones to feel alive anymore. I just needed to be present. I started eating slower, listening deeper, speaking with intention, resting without guilt, loving without conditions. And in that space, I began to dream again. But this time, not about becoming someone else. I dreamed of becoming more me, not a better version, just a truer one. One who moved through life not with fear, but with quiet power. One who didn't beg for belonging, but created spaces where she could breathe freely. One who didn't apologize for her magic. I started remembering who I was before the world tried to shape me. The little girl who danced for the trees. Who asked endless questions. Who believed she could do anything. She never left me. She was just waiting for me to return. And return I did, slowly, gently. I stopped needing to prove. Stopped needing to fix. Stopped waiting for someone else to name my worth. Because I had finally named it for myself. I looked around and realized my circle had changed. Smaller. Deeper. Full of people who saw me without needing to correct me. People who celebrated my no as much as my yes. People who knew how to hold space without trying to save me. I stopped searching for validation in empty places. Stopped scrolling for answers. Stopped molding myself to fit roles that no longer served me. And in that pause, that beautiful, sacred pause, I remembered what it felt like to belong to myself. I reconnected with my creativity, not because I needed to be productive, but because I needed to express. I painted without rules, wrote without a deadline, moved my body because it felt good, not because I was trying to control it. The awakening was this. I was no longer performing for approval. I was living for peace. I held boundaries not to punish others, but to protect my joy. I embraced slowness. I honored the rhythm of my own energy. And I realized that stillness was not laziness, it was alignment. This version of me? She doesn't chase. She attracts. She doesn't beg. She blesses. She doesn't compete. She creates. I stopped waiting for the world to tell me I mattered. I started living like I already did. And that small shift changed everything. The way I spoke to myself. The way I walked into rooms. The way I rested without earning it. The way I loved without losing myself. And the more I honored me, the more the world around me shifted. Not because it changed, but because I had. I didn't need a new life. I needed a new lens. And once I found it, once I began seeing myself through eyes of compassion instead of criticism, everything began to bloom. I was no longer afraid of being too much or not enough. I was simply here, fully, finally, and that was the awakening.